Hello there, and welcome to Poor Richard's podcast. I'm Benjamin Franklin, printer, inventor, statesman, and now apparently podcaster. Back in my day, I published pamphlets to start conversations. Today, folks do it with microphones and Wi-Fi. So here I am, back again, ready to talk about the world as it was and as it is. On this show, I'll be sitting down with some of the most fascinating minds from every corner of history. Presidents who built nations, inventors who changed the way we live, generals and philosophers who shaped the way we think. One week, it might be Abraham Lincoln or Queen Victoria. Another week, perhaps Thomas Edison or Isaac Newton. We may even host a few debates between historical rivals like Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. I may have been born in 1706, but human nature hasn't changed much. Power, faith, money, ambition, the tools are new, but the struggles are the same. My hope is to learn what connects us across centuries, and maybe help make sense of how we got here and where we're headed next. So pull up a chair, pour yourself a drink, coffee, tea, or something a bit stronger, and let's have the kind of conversation that would make the taverns of Philadelphia proud. This is Poor Richard's podcast. Let's begin. Joining me today is a man who needs no introduction, but deserves one all the same, General George Washington. He led the Continental Army through the darkest years of our Revolution, stood firm when others doubted, and later became the first president of these United States. General Washington, welcome to the program. I'd like to begin at the start, before the battles, before the politics, with the man himself. Tell us about your early life. Where did you come from? What kind of upbringing did you have? And how did those years shape the leader you would one day become?
Well, Dr. Franklin, if I start from the beginning, I was born on February 22nd, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia. My father, Augustine, owned several plantations and believed in hard work and order. He died when I was 11, and my mother Mary raised us on a modest income but with firm expectations. She taught thrift, discipline, and perhaps most of all, persistence. I wasn't sent abroad for education like some planters' sons. My schooling ended early: arithmetic, handwriting, a bit of geometry, bookkeeping, and surveying. But I learned to make the most of practical knowledge. By my teens, I was copying maxims on conduct and self-control into notebooks. I didn't think of it then as training for leadership. I just knew that a man's word and behavior were all he truly owned. When I was 17, I earned an appointment as surveyor of Culpeper County. That job sent me out beyond settled farms into the raw wilderness. Shenandoah, the valleys of the Blue Ridge, miles of forest and creek with nothing but a compass, chain, and theodolite. We slept under the open sky, ate what we carried, and fought through rain and snow to mark the land. Those months toughened me and taught the first lessons of command: never waste daylight, keep men busy, and treat them fairly. For in hardship they can turn on you or follow you, depending on your example. The work also introduced me to the Fairfax family, who were large landholders in the Northern Neck. Lord Thomas Fairfax was a learned Englishman who had come to Virginia after losing property in England. He took a liking to me, hired me to survey his holdings, and brought me into circles that would later open the door to public service. My first brush with military duty came in 1753. When Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia sent me with a message to the French commander at Fort Le Boeuf. They were building forts deep in territory claimed by Britain, and the governor wanted them warned to withdraw. It was December, bitter cold, rivers frozen or flooded, and the Allegheny Mountains thick with snow. I nearly drowned crossing an icy river on the return trip, and an Indian guide turned on me one night, raising his musket to shoot before lowering it again. I suppose that was my first real taste of what soldiers would face in the Wilderness War. The French ignored the message, and by spring of '54 I was sent back with about 150 men to assert our claim. We surprised a small French party at a place called Jumonville Glen. Shots were exchanged, and the French officer was killed, an event that began a war we hadn't fully imagined. We built a small post we called Fort Necessity, and it lived up to its name. Leaky trenches, rain, bad ground. We were surrounded by superior numbers and forced to surrender. I signed the articles without realizing they accused me of assassination. That document haunted me for years, though I was never given the chance to defend it in London.
Now, General, you mentioned something that always raises eyebrows when people study your early years, that surrender at Fort Necessity and the accusation of assassination. For the sake of our listeners, tell us plainly, what was that war? What exactly happened there? And who was it they said you had assassinated?
It was what came to be known as the French and Indian War, the struggle between Britain and France for control of the American frontier. At the time, I was a young officer serving Virginia's militia, sent west to challenge French claims in the Ohio Valley. We encountered a small French detachment near a place called Jumonville Glen. It was a tense, rain-soaked morning in May of 1754. My scouts believed the French were preparing to ambush us, so I ordered an attack. The skirmish was brief but deadly. 10 Frenchmen were killed, including their commander, Ensign Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. Later, I learned the French claimed he was on a diplomatic mission, not a combat one, though his party carried weapons and had been shadowing us for days. Whether he came as a soldier or an emissary, I cannot say with certainty even now. But that one volley of musket fire set the continent aflame. When we were later surrounded at Fort Necessity and forced to surrender, the French drafted the terms of capitulation in their own language. I signed, trusting their translation. Only afterward did I learn it described Jumonville's death as an assassination. I never meant harm beyond the bounds of war, but that word, assassination, followed me across the Atlantic. The French used it as proof that Britain had acted dishonorably, that a colonial officer had murdered a peaceful envoy. I was mortified when I discovered it. I was young, inexperienced, and desperate to protect my men. But that mistake taught me a lasting lesson. Never sign a document you don't fully understand, and never go to war without knowing who truly stands before you.
A wise lesson, General, and one that cost you dearly to learn. Yet, in a strange way, it was the first step on the path that made you famous. For that skirmish drew Europe into years of bloodshed.
That's true enough. I sometimes say the first shots of the 7 Years' War were fired by a frightened young Virginian trying to prove himself. I gained little from it but humility and experience. Still, it prepared me for the discipline and chaos I'd face again 20 years later, when the enemy wasn't France, but the mightiest army in the world.
An extraordinary start to a soldier's life, General. Please, continue from there. What happened next?
I stayed in the service, and the next year volunteered to join General Braddock's expedition against Fort Duquesne. The British regulars were well drilled but unprepared for frontier warfare. On July 9th, 1755, we were ambushed near the Monongahela. The air filled with smoke and screaming. Horses bolted, men broke ranks, officers fell. 2 horses were shot under me. 4 bullets went through my coat, yet somehow I was untouched. I helped rally what remained and carried the dying Braddock off the field. It was chaos. Brave men dying not from cowardice, but confusion. That day convinced me that discipline must be joined with flexibility, or it's useless in America's woods. After that disaster, the governor made me commander of the Virginia Regiment. I spent the next 3 years defending a frontier 300 miles long with barely 700 men. We built a string of small forts, chased raiding parties, and tried to keep settlers from panicking. I learned that leading soldiers meant being everywhere, in the trenches, at the wagons, in the council chamber, because fear spreads fastest when officers disappear. When General Forbes took Fort Duquesne in '58, I resigned my commission. The war had taught me courage, endurance, and how little glory there really is in battle. The next year I married Martha Custis, a widow of good sense and warm heart. She brought 2 children and considerable property. I devoted myself to Mount Vernon, farming, experimenting with new crops, studying drainage and crop rotation, breeding mules, and trying to make my estate productive without exhausting the soil. For the next 15 years, I lived as a planter and legislator. I served in the House of Burgesses, sat on local courts, and managed the affairs of my neighbors as justice of the peace. I enjoyed that life, steady, orderly, and close to the land. But the peace began to fray. Parliament's new taxes, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and later the Townshend duties, seemed to treat us not as citizens, but as revenue to be drained. We resisted with petitions and non-importation agreements. I supported them all, not because I hated Britain, but because I thought the liberty of Englishmen must be equal on both sides of the ocean.
General, you just mentioned the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend duties. Words that every student of history has heard, but few really understand. For the sake of clarity, could you explain what those laws were, what they meant for the colonies, and how they led to the crisis in Boston?
Gladly. Each of those acts came from Parliament's belief that the colonies should help pay for the expenses of the British Empire, especially the debts from the French and Indian War. The first was the Sugar Act of 1764, which placed taxes on molasses, sugar, wine, and other imports. To most in London, it seemed a small thing, but to us it was the start of something new, taxation enforced directly from Parliament, not our own assemblies. It hit merchants and ship owners hardest, especially in New England, and it set the tone for everything that followed. Next came the Stamp Act of 1765, which required that nearly every printed item, newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards, carry an official stamp purchased from British agents. That stirred the entire continent. It wasn't the money alone that angered people. It was the principle. We believed only our own colonial legislatures had the right to levy taxes upon us, since we had no representatives in Parliament. Hence the cry, "No taxation without representation." The uproar was so strong that London repealed the Stamp Act within a year, but they couldn't leave it alone. The very next set of measures, the Townshend duties of 1767, taxed glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea, everyday goods. Those revenues were used to pay royal officials in the colonies, which meant our governors and judges no longer depended on our assemblies. In short, it took power away from the people and handed it back to the crown. As resentment grew, tensions turned violent. There were protests, boycotts, and incidents between soldiers and citizens. You may recall, Doctor, the tragedy in 1770, the so-called Boston Massacre, when British troops fired into a crowd, killing several men. It deepened the divide. But the breaking point came in 1773, when Parliament gave the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in America, letting them undercut colonial merchants even with the tax included. To many, it looked like a trick to make us accept taxation in disguise. That's when a group of Bostonians disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians, boarded ships in the harbor, and threw hundreds of chests of tea into the water. The Crown's response was swift and harsh. In 1774, Parliament passed what we called the Coercive Acts, one of which closed the port of Boston entirely until the destroyed tea was paid for. No ships in or out. It was economic strangulation. That act convinced many of us that this was no longer about trade, but about whether we were free men or subjects to be ruled at a distance.
So the closing of Boston's port wasn't an isolated punishment. It was the spark that lit the fuse.
Exactly. When Boston's port was closed in '74, Virginia called a convention. I spoke little, but when the question came of helping Massachusetts, I voted in favor. They elected me to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, where I met men like you, Dr. Franklin, and learned how broad our cause really was. I still hoped for peace, but when the shots were fired at Lexington and Concord the next year, it was plain that words had failed.
Those words, the shots fired at Lexington and Concord, have echoed through history. For the benefit of our listeners, General, could you tell us exactly what happened there? What were those shots, and how did they turn protest into open war?
Certainly. By early 1775, the tension between the colonies and the Crown had reached its breaking point. British troops were stationed in Boston under General Gage, and the countryside was full of militia companies training in secret. The people had begun collecting arms and powder, expecting that force would soon be used to disarm them. In April, General Gage received orders to seize those supplies stored in the town of Concord, a few miles inland from Boston. He sent out roughly 700 regulars under Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, moving by night to catch the militia unprepared. But the countryside was alive with messengers. Men like Paul Revere and William Dawes rode through the darkness, warning that the British were coming. When the column reached the village of Lexington at dawn on April 19th, they found about 70 militiamen standing on the green. No one knows who fired first. Each side later blamed the other. But a single shot rang out, and within moments volleys followed. 8 Americans were killed, several more wounded. The soldiers pushed on to Concord, searching for weapons, but there the local militia gathered in larger numbers and met them at the North Bridge. They fired upon the British advance, forcing them to fall back. From that moment, the retreat to Boston became a running battle. Farmers and tradesmen fired from behind trees and stone walls all along the road. By the time the column reached safety, more than 200 British were killed or wounded. The countryside was in arms. Men poured in from every direction. That day changed everything. It wasn't a riot or a mob. It was organized resistance. The colonies were at war, whether we had declared it or not.
A single volley, and suddenly there was no turning back. Please, General, continue.
In June of 75, the Congress created a Continental Army, and to my astonishment named me its commander. I told them I did not think myself equal to the command I was honored with, but I would devote all I had, my fortune, my health, and my life, to the cause of liberty. I refused any salary beyond expenses and left for Massachusetts within days. When I reached Cambridge, I found brave men in arms, but little resembling an army. No uniforms, few muskets, and powder enough for perhaps 9 cartridges per man. The officers quarreled over rank. The men came and went with the harvest. I imposed order, sometimes harshly, but we needed discipline more than popularity. Through that winter we dug trenches, built redoubts, and waited. When Colonel Knox dragged cannon from Ticonderoga over mountains and frozen rivers, we mounted them on Dorchester Heights overlooking Boston. The British ships could not stay under our guns. On March 17th, 1776, they sailed for Halifax. Boston was free, and the new nation had its first victory.
So, General, Boston had been freed and the war stood at a hopeful beginning. Tell us what came next.
After the British evacuated Boston, I knew they would strike next at New York. Its harbor was deep, its position central, and whoever held it would control the Hudson and divide the colonies. So in the spring of 1776, I marched the army south. We arrived to find a city little prepared for war, merchants still trading, loyalists still whispering. I set the men to building fortifications from the Battery up to Harlem Heights. We cut redoubts into the rocky ground and dragged cannon up from the docks with oxen. By June, the enemy's fleet appeared like a forest of masts off Staten Island, ship after ship, until the bay seemed paved with sails. I rode the lines daily, and wherever I went, the men would ask, "General, how many are they?" I told them the truth. General Howe's armada was the largest ever sent across the Atlantic, over 400 ships, 30,000 troops, and 10,000 sailors.
General, how many did you have in comparison?
Our army had far fewer, around 20,000 men, though few were trained soldiers. Most were farmers, tradesmen, or boys barely old enough to shave. They had courage, but little discipline, and almost no powder. Every musket ball was counted like gold. In July, the Declaration of Independence arrived. I read it aloud to the army while they stood in ranks under the open sky. Many cheered. Some stared in silence, knowing it meant we must either win or die as traitors. It hardened us in its way.
And what was your own opinion of the Declaration, General?
I felt it was both a solemn necessity and a final break. For years I'd hoped for reconciliation, but after all that had happened, it was clear the king would never see us as equals. The Declaration spoke to every man's natural rights, to live, to think, to be governed only by consent. It was dangerous, yes, but honest. And I believed then, as I do now, that honesty is worth the risk. When August came, General Howe landed on Long Island with nearly 30,000 men. Our outposts on the heights saw movement in the fog, but couldn't tell the scale of it. I placed General Greene to guard the left at Jamaica Pass, but sickness took him, and the command fell to Sullivan. Howe moved his columns around that pass under cover of night, and by the morning of the 27th was behind our flank. The fighting near the old stone house was savage, smoke, shouting, and confusion. Men fell back toward the heights. Some threw down their arms, others fought to the last. I watched from a rise on the Brooklyn side and realized the army could be trapped between the enemy and the river. Through the night of the 29th, we ferried the whole army across the East River, men, horses, cannon, in small boats. A fog thick as wool settled at dawn, masking the retreat. Not one life was lost in the crossing. When the fog lifted, the British found empty lines. That was Providence, plain and simple. But the campaign did not end there. Howe moved again in September, landing at Kip's Bay. Our militia broke at the first cannon shot. I rode among them, furious, but there was no stopping the rout. A day later at Harlem Heights we stood our ground, met their advance with musket and bayonet, and drove them back a mile. It was a small thing, but it restored the army's heart. October brought another trial. The British maneuvered north, and we fought again at White Plains. They took the high ground. I pulled the army back behind the Croton to preserve it. Then came the disaster at Fort Washington. I had ordered the position abandoned, but delays and pride kept it occupied. On November 16th it fell, and 2,600 men were captured. A few days later, Fort Lee was evacuated as the enemy crossed the river.
What was it like for those captured men, General? How were they treated under British captivity?
Badly, Doctor. Worse than beasts. The British prison ships anchored in New York Harbor became floating graves. Men were packed below decks, starved, beaten, and left in filth. Disease ran wild, smallpox, typhus, hunger. Thousands perished there, most never even listed by name. It angered me beyond measure. We fought a war for liberty, yet they treated prisoners as less than human. I vowed then that if fortune turned, our side would show mercy where theirs had shown none. That began the retreat through New Jersey, a miserable, freezing march with the enemy always close behind. We burned bridges, destroyed boats, and gathered every skiff along the Delaware to keep them from following. The people along the road looked at us in silence. Some jeered, others wept. I could not blame them. We looked beaten. Morale was near collapse. Some men had no shoes. Others left trails of blood on the frozen ground. I saw men sitting by campfires in silence, staring into the flames as if wondering whether the cause was worth another day. By early December, we reached Pennsylvania with only a few thousand men fit for duty. The enlistments would expire on the last day of the year. If we did nothing, the cause would end with the calendar. So I resolved on a blow that might revive the spirit of the nation.
So this leads to the famous crossing of the Delaware River.
Indeed it does. We gathered boats near McConkey's Ferry on Christmas night. The river was choked with ice, and the wind cut like a knife. I rowed along the line, urging the men on. No talk, just the sound of oars and creaking wood. We crossed in darkness, 9 hours against the current, then marched through sleet toward Trenton. The Hessian garrison there was caught completely off guard. We attacked at dawn, bayonets fixed, drums silent. In less than an hour we took nearly 1,000 prisoners, all their cannon, and not a dozen of our own were killed or wounded.
Who were these Hessians, General? Why were they here fighting alongside Britain?
They were German mercenaries, hired by the British Crown, most from Hesse-Cassel, others from Brunswick and Waldeck, well-trained, disciplined soldiers, but they fought for pay, not for principle. To them, America was another battlefield. To us, it was home. That difference made all the difference. That victory changed everything. I knew we had to follow it quickly or lose the advantage. Within days, we fought again, holding the Assunpink Creek against Cornwallis's advance, then slipped around his flank by night and struck Princeton at sunrise. When the smoke cleared, the British garrison was routed, and we withdrew to the high ground at Morristown for winter quarters. That attack impressed our new allies. France saw that we would fight with courage even when defeat seemed certain.
I remember those days well. I was in France at the time, carrying the news and arguing our case in salons and ministerial chambers. Many there thought our struggle hopeless, that we were a band of farmers facing the greatest empire on earth. But when word came of Trenton and Princeton, it changed everything. It showed that America would not fold. Those victories did more for diplomacy than any speech I could have made. Please, General, continue.
The months that followed were hard but hopeful. We had won something more valuable than land, belief. Through the spring and summer of 1777, we rebuilt. But in June we learned that Howe had left New York by sea. For weeks we didn't know where he was bound. New England, the Chesapeake. When word came that his fleet was moving up the bay toward Philadelphia, I marched the army south to meet him. In September we took position along Brandywine Creek. I thought the fords were secure, but the enemy crossed higher up and came down upon our flank again. The air filled with musket fire and powder smoke so thick a man could scarcely see his hand. We fought 9 hours and then withdrew, blooded but intact. A few weeks later, we tried again at Germantown. The plan was daring, 4 columns attacking at dawn. But the morning was thick with fog. One column fired into another, thinking them the enemy. Confusion spread. Orders were lost in the smoke. We were driven back after 4 hours of fighting. Still, that attack impressed our new allies. France saw that we would fight with courage even in defeat. After that, we marched to White Marsh, then to Valley Forge for the winter. I can still see that place, snow on the hills, bare trees, the sound of axes as men cut logs for huts. We had 12,000 troops. Nearly 3,000 were unfit for duty from sickness or lack of shoes. You could trace the army's path by the blood on the snow. I spent the days writing letters to Congress, to state governors, to anyone who could send food or clothing. Wagons bogged down in mud. Contractors cheated us. Soldiers grew gaunt. There were times I doubted whether the army would survive the season. But from that suffering came the discipline we needed. Baron von Steuben arrived, a tall, sharp man who'd served in the Prussian army. He cursed in French, German, and broken English, but the men loved him. He taught them the manual of arms, how to form ranks, load, and fire as one body. By spring we had the look of soldiers. When the ice melted, I rode through the camps and could hardly believe it was the same army. They moved with precision. They obeyed instantly, and though they still lacked shoes, their eyes showed confidence. It was then, too, that the alliance with France was confirmed. It gave us money, supplies, and the promise of a fleet. In June of '78, the British evacuated Philadelphia and began marching toward New York. We followed them across New Jersey and met them at Monmouth Courthouse. The day was brutally hot. Some men fainted at their posts, canteens boiled. An initial miscommunication nearly ruined us. One division fell back too soon, but we rallied on high ground and fought the enemy line to a standstill. When night fell, they slipped away. The field was ours. That was the proof we'd needed since the war began. That American troops, trained and disciplined, could stand against the best army in the world. After Monmouth, we turned north again, fortifying the Hudson Highlands. I chose West Point for the anchor of our defense. The bend of the river there made it ideal. We laid massive chains across the water to bar enemy ships and built fortifications into the rocks. That became our backbone for the rest of the war.
Those must have been years of constant strain, General. The men see only the victories. They rarely see the weight of command. Tell me, during those winters and marches, what held you together? What made you believe the cause could still succeed when the odds said otherwise?
What held me together, Doctor, was duty. I believed that if we could endure, time and geography would fight for us. The British had ships and money, but they had to feed and pay their armies across an ocean. We only had to keep ours alive. There were nights at Valley Forge when I walked among the huts and heard the men coughing in the dark, and I wondered whether I was leading them to their deaths or to liberty. But whenever doubt crept in, I would remember the faces of the farmers who left their plows, the blacksmiths, the boys too young for the weight of a musket, and I knew that if I faltered, their hope would falter with me. It wasn't courage that kept me moving, it was the knowledge that I had no right to stop. I rode the lines often that year, visiting outposts at Newburgh, Fishkill, and West Point. The men's huts were patched with old canvas, their uniforms little more than rags dyed brown by smoke. They still drilled, still saluted, still stood watch, though the war had lost its fire. I spoke to them about patience, about honor, about finishing with the dignity we had fought for. I believe they listened because they saw I meant every word. The following spring, word came at last that the preliminary articles of peace had been signed in Paris. The fighting was over. We had won recognition of our independence, and the British Parliament had ordered evacuation. I should have been overjoyed, but the greatest danger of all still lay ahead, the disbanding of the army. Idle soldiers without pay are tinder for chaos. In March of 1783, anonymous letters began circulating among the officers at Newburgh, calling on them to demand their pay by force if Congress would not act. When those papers reached me, I felt my heart sink. 8 years of sacrifice could have been undone in a single week of rage. I called a meeting of the officers and told them I would address them in person. When I entered the hall, the men rose and fell silent. I had prepared remarks, but when I tried to read them, the words blurred. I took out my spectacles, which few had ever seen me wear, and said, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown grey, but almost blind in the service of my country." That small truth broke whatever anger remained. Many wept openly. The meeting ended in calm. The rebellion that might have ruined the Republic died then and there. In April, I issued the proclamation that all hostilities would cease. Through the summer, we waited while the British prepared to leave New York. On November 25, 1783, their last troops sailed from the harbor, and our flag was raised over the city. It was a moment of solemn satisfaction, not triumph, but completion. I rode down Broadway with my officers. The crowds cheered, but I felt only fatigue. 8 years of command had aged me beyond recognition. A few weeks later, I journeyed to Annapolis, where Congress was sitting, to resign my commission. On December 23rd, I stood before them in the State House chamber. The hall was crowded, yet so quiet that every word seemed to echo. I spoke simply, that I returned the trust they had placed in me and wished only for retirement at Mount Vernon. When I finished, many wept. I bowed and walked out a private citizen. It was the proudest moment of my life. I reached Mount Vernon just in time for Christmas. Martha met me at the door, and for the first time in nearly a decade I sat at my own table as a free man. The farm had suffered, fences down, fields neglected. But the sight of home was medicine enough. I spent the next years restoring the estate, planting wheat instead of tobacco, improving crop rotation, building a new mill and a distillery, and riding my fields from dawn to dark. I had no wish ever to leave again. Yet peace brought new troubles. The Articles of Confederation proved too weak. Congress had no power to tax, to regulate trade, or to compel obedience. States quarreled like jealous neighbors. Paper money flooded the markets, debts went unpaid, and the credit of the new nation sank low. Farmers in Massachusetts took up arms in protest, and many feared anarchy. I hoped others would find the remedy, but my correspondence grew thick with appeals. In 1786, men like Madison and Hamilton pressed for a general convention to revise the Articles. I resisted at first. I had promised myself and Martha that my days of public service were finished. But when the call came for a meeting in Philadelphia, I knew my duty. I agreed to attend, not to lead, but to lend what steadiness my name might bring.
Indeed, General, that was the Constitutional Convention, a gathering the likes of which the world had rarely seen. Men from every state, each with his own vision of liberty and government, all crammed into that sweltering hall in Philadelphia. I remember it well. The air was heavy with argument, thicker still with hope. We shut the windows against eavesdroppers, but the sound of debate could have lifted the roof. I confess there were moments I doubted we'd reach any accord. Some feared monarchy, others anarchy, and every man feared losing what his state had won. Yet somehow, through patience, reason, and no small measure of compromise, a framework began to take shape. I recall saying near the end, as I signed my name, that I was not sure whether the sun painted on the back of your chair was rising or setting, but at last I believed it to be rising. Please, General, continue.
Yes, Dr. Franklin, the convention tested every nerve and ounce of patience I possessed. Delegates came with different hopes. Some wanted a stronger national government, others feared a return to monarchy. I was chosen unanimously to preside. I spoke little, for I believed my presence would do more than my words. The debates were fierce: representation, slavery, the balance between large and small states. Each compromise cost something, yet in the end they produced a constitution that bound liberty with law. I signed it with relief but also apprehension. No system devised by man can endure without virtue among the people. I wrote that the Constitution was the best we could obtain, not perfect, but better than endless discord. When the states began ratifying it, I returned home again, determined to remain there whatever came next. But the letters kept arriving. They came from every state, urging me to accept the presidency if called. I wanted no part of it. I had seen enough of power to know its burdens. Still, I feared that refusal might appear selfish, or worse, might weaken faith in the new government before it began. In February of 1789, the electoral votes were counted. Unanimous, every elector. I was in my fields when the messenger arrived with the news. For a moment I said nothing. Then I turned to Martha and told her I must go once more into public service. She said only that she hoped it would be the last time.
You speak of accepting the presidency, General. But tell us, how did that come to pass? Why were you chosen so unanimously, and how exactly were you nominated? For the sake of those listening today, explain what that process was like in those early days, before there was precedent or party.
It was unlike any election the world had seen. There were no campaigns, no speeches, no contests of popularity. The nation was still a fragile creation, a handful of states learning to breathe under a new constitution. The electors met in their respective states in early 1789 to choose the first officers under that constitution. I had no hand in it, nor did I wish to. I remained quietly at Mount Vernon, hoping the honor might pass to another. But from every state the letters came, from Adams in Massachusetts, from Hamilton in New York, from Madison in Virginia, all saying the same thing, that the new government could not stand unless I consented to lead it. When the votes were counted that April, I was told that the choice had been unanimous. All 69 electors had cast their ballots for me. John Adams received the next highest number and thus became vice president, as the system then required. There was no celebration in my household that night. I felt the weight of it more than the honor. The new Constitution had only just taken root. Its survival was uncertain. I knew that every word, every action, every decision of mine would set a precedent, that the shape of the office itself would depend on how I carried it. So, when I received word officially from Charles Thompson, Secretary of the Old Congress, I accepted, not out of desire, but out of duty.
A unanimous choice, a rare thing indeed. And if ever a nation was to place its fate in one man's stead, it chose wisely. 13 states, newly bound by a constitution, spoke with one voice. It is a testament not only to your service, General, but to the trust you earned in every camp and council from Cambridge to Yorktown. And with that, we'll bring this episode to a close. We've followed you from your birth in Virginia, through the wilderness campaigns, the long years of revolution, and now to the threshold of a new republic, the moment the people called you to lead once more. In part 2 of our conversation, we'll explore what came after: President Washington's years in office, the trials of building a government from nothing, the precedents that still shape the nation today. I'm Benjamin Franklin, and this has been Poor Richard's Podcast.